Hi guys. Yeah. Ooh, lovely. Hi guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. And I thought, excuse me, as soon as we're into the run-up to Christmas, that I do a couple of 3 videos on the subject of food. Medieval food, obviously. Now, contrary to popular belief, medieval people weren't going hungry. Not even the farmers or the peasants or the serfs. Nobody really went hungry, apart from during times of famine, which did occur and did cause problems. But generally speaking, on a day-to-day basis, people were well fed. So I thought we'd have the first video. I thought we'd just look at the basics, and we'll have a look at what food they were eating, where it was coming from, and how they produced it. So, to start off with, if we look at, we'll start at the bottom of the pile, the medieval farmer, the serf, the tenant farmer. There were lots of them, and they were either producing livestock or they were producing arable crops or a mixture of the two. Most farms produced a mixture. Now, generally speaking, your medieval arable farm was producing various grains such as wheat, barley, oats, that sort of thing, as well as beans, which were introduced by the Normans, and we still eat a lot of them even to today in England and the United Kingdom. Everybody's heard of the British penchant for beans on toast that nobody seems to understand. Well, you can thank the Normans for that. For instance, we eat haricot beans, haricot vert beans, which were introduced by the Normans. Admittedly, the tomato flavoured ones didn't appear until the 1800s. But before then, we had all sorts of recipes. I found a couple of really nice sounding recipes, actually. One was, two of them were beans and bacon. But one was beans and bacon with cherries, which you created a sauce with cherries and cream, and apparently with the bacon, it's a sort of sweet and sour. And then there's a beans with bacon and hazelnuts, and apparently you cook your beans in a cream and garlic sauce. You soften the hazelnuts and then add them in, and then you eat with crispy bacon. It's supposed to be really, really nice. I might have to have a try at some point. But anyway, we're getting off the point. So crops were grown, and the growing season was sort of mid-March through till September, October. Now, when we get through to November, that's actually the start of the meat season, shall we call it. And traditionally, in England, the culling and production, the culling and preparing of meat starts on the 11th of November, which is Martinmas, or St. Martin's Day. And generally speaking, it's from that point on that you would see the systematic culling and preparing and preserving of meat all the way through the winter, from November all the way through till the end of March, the beginning of April. And it was systematic, stepped, and quite formal actually, so that meat was available all the way through the winter, and depending on how it was preserved, all the way through all the way through the summer, until November, until Christmas. So come next Christmas, depending on how wealthy you were, what you had available, how the various meats were prepared, next Christmas you might actually be eating meat that was prepared this year. But we'll get into that. So what was available? Well, your average farm, as we've said, had the various arable crops available. Beans, peas, that sort of thing. There were also, in the royal forests, you could scavenge, you could hunt out mushrooms, all that sort of stuff, as long as you weren't hunting and you weren't caught in the forest with a bow and an arrow. You could actually look up and hunt up various mushrooms, fungi, herbs, that sort of thing. So you could add them into. You could go out to the coastline if you were close enough, and you could collect samphire and things like that to spice up your food. Wild garlic, readily available during the spring. People would collect it and store it and keep it and use that, dry it and use that throughout the year. So there was lots of herbs and spices available. Meat-wise, in the forests you had you had venison and wild boar, which are classed as game. You also had game birds such as pheasant, peacock, grouse on the moors, that sort of thing, which were generally reserved for nobility. In the coastal areas, in the marshlands, you had geese, ducks, coots, moorhens, snipe, all sorts of birds, which there were no restrictions on in terms of hunting. If you could hunt them, you could eat them and you could take them, and there was no comeback on that whatsoever. Perfectly fine for anybody to hunt in the wetlands. So those were your wild foods. Rabbits in the 1300s, the 13th century, were still tended to be the part of the domain of the nobility, because they were basically farmed. They'd been brought here by the Normans, who created man-made warrens for them, and they were actually basically farmed for the nobility, for the fur and for the meat, which the Normans loved. So you didn't get rabbit very often, but you could take hare as a commoner. Now, on the farms, you had lots of choice. Most farms had small flocks of geese. Well, I'm saying small, had flocks of geese with a breeding set of one gander and maybe 3 or 4 breeding females or gooses. And from those you could get upwards of 40 or 50 produce geese over the course of the year. Usually you'd have 2 or 3 clutches of eggs laid, each one of around about 7 or 8 chicks. So you could have 30, 40, possibly even 50 birds available to use as produce when we get to this time of the year. Now, geese were quite important because, as we've discussed before, you could actually pay your taxes with goose feather. So not only were geese, grey-lag geese, available in the marshlands, but they were also available to you as a farmer. If you had a small flock going, you could actually pay your entire tax bill for the year if you played your cards right. But as well as the flight feathers, which were used for fletching, the softer body feathers could be collected and used in your own mattresses, or they could be sold to mattress makers to go into manor houses and castles and things like that. As well as that, goose skin was used to make leather, to make really fine, hard-wearing leather if it was processed properly. And it was quite sought after for making lightweight gloves. Now, when goose skin is tanned properly, it produces a really soft, thin leather, which is either off-white or cream-coloured. And it was quite sought after for ladies' hats and gloves, even in the 13th and 14th century. So that was another byproduct that could be sold to earn a few pennies, in addition to whatever wages or whatever was coming your way as well. So that's the geese, quite important. Now chickens weren't quite as common as you might think in the 13th century. They were introduced by the Romans, but they were still quite scarce in terms of overall numbers. But where they were used again for eating. But generally, they were actually kept for the eggs. They didn't tend to eat the chicken as much. They tended to eat the goose more than they did the chicken, and they would sell the eggs at the local market or to the bakers, or they would sell them to the local manor, that sort of thing. So it was quite an intricate system going on. So, and then we had your pigs. Most farms would have a breeding group of pigs, possibly one boar and 3 or 4 breeding sows, from which you could get 2 litters a year, of an average of 7 or 8 pigs per litter. So if you've got 3 breeding pairs, 3 breeding sows, that's a potential of 48 pigs that can be sold on as they mature. Most pigs, within about 6 months, by the time they're about 6 to 8 months old, weigh about 150 kilos. And of that, you could actually get about 120 kilos of meat from them. That could be sold on directly, straight away, once it was butchered. But you could do that twice a year. So the pigs that were born were born at the beginning of the year, would actually at the end of the slaughter, like say March next year, would be getting culled at this time of the year. The ones that were born during the summer would be culled when we get to March. So you had 2 culling periods. So you could actually, if you planned it out properly, you could have pork being produced all the way through the winter, from November all the way through to March and April. And depending on how you preserved the meat, that meant that you could actually have pork all year round. Now the way they did this was, there was 2 main methods. Shut up. There was 2 main methods. There was salting and there was smoking. Now this was what the smaller farms would do. They would actually, like for instance, salting. Basically, you would get sea salt or you would get saltpeter, which was available. It's a byproduct of the cesspit in your back garden, of the urine you were actually producing. You would use saltpeter, potassium nitrate, and you would rub it into the joint of beef, the joint of meat, the joint of pork. And if you did it properly and you'd continue that progress over a couple of weeks, you could actually preserve or create a shelf-stable piece of meat that might last without refrigeration, without cooling, for a couple of months. Stick it up on the shelf and you could slice it off over quite a long period of time. Now, if you were producing that to go into a monastery or a manor house or a castle, most of these big buildings had their own cold room. And it's actually quite technologically savvy, these people. They actually harvested ice from the lakes and the rivers during the winter, and they could store it in these underground cold rooms, and it would last almost the entire year. And it was cold enough that you could actually almost freeze meat and veg and produce, fruit and things, and you could have a ready supply of meat and produce throughout the entire year. So your farms would produce your pork, and then that would go off to the market or go off to the local manor or whatever. And if it was salted properly, it could last in the entire year. The other process was smoking, which is basically a cooking method. And each little farm would have its own smokehouse, or there'd be a communal smokehouse for every 3 or 4 farms or something like that. And for a 2-day smoke, of around about 150 degrees. You could smoke anywhere from 110 all the way to 210 degrees. But an average 2-day smoke of about 150 degrees would preserve meat long enough, it would last a month and a half. If you chilled it, it could last 6 months. So it was quite an important process, which was done systematically throughout the whole of the winter. A group of 5 or 6 farms could produce enough pork to supply an entire county over the whole of the winter into the summer. So it was quite an important thing. So you have your geese, you have your pork. Sheep, they were a bit different. They were up on the moors, and generally speaking, they weren't eaten so much. They were kept for the wool, which is another video in its entirety. But they tended to be kept for wool rather than for food. I mean, some of them were eaten, but generally speaking, they were a wool-producing product. Your cows, now the average cow herd size was around about 100 head, of which you would have 50 breeding stock, so you'd have 40 breeding cows and maybe 3, 4, 5 bulls, and then they would double the size. Generally speaking, 40 cows would produce another 40 cows over the year. Now they would be born in the spring, and then generally speaking, over the culling period from November through to March, they would be systematically butchered and turned into produce. Again, it's quite systematic. Now, generally speaking, beef was only really eaten by the nobility and by the wealthy. It was quite an expensive animal to produce, because it was only something like 1 in every 10 farms was actually a cattle farm. So it was a little bit more expensive, a little bit more intensive to produce, therefore a little bit more expensive to buy. So it tended to get eaten straight away, and it wasn't until later on in the winter season that you would see people starting to preserve it, usually by salting, and then or by freezing in the cold rooms under the manors and under the castles and the monasteries. So there we go. So that's how they provided the food. Generally speaking, your peasant farmers had access to meat for most of the winter and some of the summer. And then from the midsummer onwards until the beginning of winter, they tended to only have access to arable crops, your beans and your peas and things like that. So they would produce a pottage which would be on the go all the time. But they would still have access to seafood and to wildfowl that was caught wild, and their own flocks of geese and etc. The middle classes, the merchant classes, they would have access to meat all year round. But only certain types of meat. They wouldn't generally have access to venison or boar, or some of the like game birds like grouse, partridge, pheasant, peacock, swan. They wouldn't have access to that. Those sorts of meats, the game meats like a venison, etc., were almost exclusively for nobility, for the landowners and the landed gentry and the nobility and the royalty. For instance, we know if you were even caught in a royal wood, a royal forest, with a bow and an arrow, you could expect some dire retribution just for walking. Anyway, so there's a quick overview of what sort of foodstuffs were available. Or just to continue the mention, they had also carrots, parsnips, turnips, that sort of thing. Obviously potatoes weren't discovered yet, they were still away in the New World. But there were lots of root vegetables. They tended to be cooked into things like stews and pottage and things like that. They didn't tend to eat them the way we do, as in roasting them. They tended to bake them into pies, or they'd make them into pottages or soups, that sort of thing. But again, it was, as I said, they were a lot better fed, and they actually had quite healthy diets. At least the lower classes had actually quite a good healthy diet going on, apart from times of famine, but that's another video. Anyway, hope you found it interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers guys, slán.